He thought he had forever, until the earth swallowed him whole. Ethan Miller was just 17, a small-town Montana kid with a future wide open in front of him and no interest in faith, God, or anything beyond what he could see or touch. He had grown up with church in the background, Sunday school crafts, quiet prayers before dinner, but by high school, he'd decided all of it was just fear dressed up as tradition. Faith, to him, was a story people clung to when they were afraid of dying. That summer morning in late July started like any other. Montana's skies stretched endlessly above him. The air smelled of pine and dry dirt. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance. Yellowstone National Park was just a familiar neighbor, majestic to tourists, ordinary to Ethan. His dad worked as a park guide. His mom was a nurse. To Ethan, Yellowstone was home. The rivers he'd skipped rocks across, the trails he'd hiked 100 times, the peaks he'd climbed with scraped-up knees and teenage bravado. He set out that day with his two best friends, Ryan and Caleb. They had plans to meet up with a couple girls later, so they were mostly just killing time, climbing rocks, cracking jokes, throwing fake punches like they had something to prove. The wild felt safe. The earth, reliable. Nothing seemed out of place, until it was. They reached a remote part of the trail near a steep rock formation. Ryan, always the first to push boundaries, scaled it with ease and called down to Ethan, daring him to follow. Ethan started climbing, adrenaline rushing, brushing off the strange, tight feeling in his chest, a heaviness he couldn't quite explain. Then came the tremor. It started small, a low, rolling shake beneath their feet. Caleb shouted, half laughing, "Did you feel that?" Ethan tried to play it cool. "Probably just a small quake," he said. But deep inside, something told him this wasn't just another Yellowstone tremor. They climbed higher, trying to get a better view. Then the second tremor hit. Sharper, meaner. Rocks rattled loose around Ethan. Ryan shouted again, but his voice was swallowed in the chaos. The slope shifted violently. Ethan's feet gave way. He slipped. Gravel scraped his arms. His backpack snagged on an edge. But then a rock, roughly the size of a basketball, dislodged and slammed into his leg. The pain was immediate and blinding. He screamed, but the sound was distant, like it was coming from someone else. He was pinned, crushed. His friends shouted his name, but their voices sounded far away. His chest tightened. His heartbeat slowed. His breath came in shallow gasps. The edges of his vision blurred, and then everything went black. But this wasn't sleep. It wasn't fainting. It felt like falling into a black ocean with no bottom. His body was gone. The pain disappeared. Silence wrapped around him. And that was the moment it all began. Not the end of his life, but the beginning of a journey that would shake him to his soul. And that was the moment it all began. Not the end of his life, but the beginning of a journey that would shake him to his soul. If you want to know what he saw beyond death, subscribe now, drop your thoughts in the comments, and ask the questions you're afraid to speak out loud. As Ethan's body lay crushed beneath the weight of stone and silence, his spirit drifted into something unexplainable, a place beyond the borders of life and death. The pain, once searing, was now gone. He no longer felt blood in his veins or weight in his limbs. He wasn't breathing, but he wasn't suffocating either. He was simply floating. At first there was only darkness, vast, still, and oddly comforting. But then, somewhere in the distance, a light appeared, faint like a candle flickering through a fog. Slowly it grew, warmer, stronger. And as Ethan was drawn toward it, something inside him began to stir. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like awe, the kind of feeling you get when you realize you're standing in the presence of something far greater than yourself. He felt the light calling him, not with words, but with a deep familiarity, as if it already knew who he was. The kind of call that bypassed the ears and reached straight into the soul. For a moment, he surrendered to it, weightless and free, drifting like a leaf on a breeze made of pure love. He could see his body far below, broken and still. Ryan was frantically trying to move the rock. Caleb was yelling into his phone, probably begging for a signal. But that world felt distant now. It was no longer his. Then, without warning, everything changed. Just as peace began to settle over him, something pulled him sideways, violently, abruptly, like an invisible hand had gripped his spirit and yanked him away from the warmth. The light receded into the distance, and he was cast into a place where even the memory of hope seemed to vanish. Darkness. But not like night or a room without light. This darkness was alive, heavy, suffocating. The kind of darkness that feels like it's watching you. Ethan found himself standing, if standing even made sense in this strange, bodiless state, on the edge of something vast and empty. Before him stretched a void so deep, so endless, it swallowed all sense of time and direction. It was as if creation itself had been drained of color and meaning. And then he heard it. The screams. Not loud at first. Just a single cry, distant and desperate. But then another, and another. They rose in waves, filling the air with a kind of pain no words could carry. It wasn't just physical suffering. It was sorrow, despair, regret, 1,000 voices crying out from unseen places, each one echoing with the unbearable weight of finality. Ethan's chest tightened. If he'd had a heartbeat, it would have pounded out of rhythm. If he had breath, it would have caught in his throat. The sound wasn't just around him. It was inside him, pressing against his soul like water against a drowning man. He wanted to run. He tried to turn, to look back toward the light. But something held him still. A presence, not cruel, but unmovable. Like a teacher showing a student something they had to see, no matter how hard it was. And then, a voice. Software gentle, sorrowful. Do you see, Ethan? This is what it means to be far from me. It didn't come from beside him or above him. It came from within the light he had once been near, and yet it reached him even in this place of torment. The voice carried no anger, no threat, only grief, as if the one speaking wasn't condemning, but mourning. Ethan trembled. He didn't know who was speaking, not fully, but deep down, something inside him knew. This voice had always been near, even when he ignored it. Even when he laughed off faith, pushed away prayer, and rolled his eyes at people who talked about God. Now, it was all crashing in. He looked out over the void again, and the darkness shifted. It writhed. Shadows slithered across unseen ground like smoke with teeth. He couldn't make out faces, but he knew that souls were there. Countless souls. Some cursed, others cried, a few screamed names, apologies, or prayers, but none of them seemed to rise beyond the black. The air was thick with hatred, fear, and a kind of loneliness that cut deeper than isolation. Ethan suddenly realized something horrifying. This wasn't a place people were thrown into. It was a place they had chosen. Not all at once, but piece by piece over a lifetime of saying no to truth, to love, to grace. Every small rejection had led them here. He tried to look away. "Why are you showing me this?" he whispered, though he had no lips or tongue to speak. "Because you must understand the reality of choice," the voice answered. "Life is not just about what is seen. Every soul is eternal." The words rang like bells through his spirit, clear, heavy, and irreversible. As he stood trembling, something in the darkness moved. A figure, not fully human, not fully formed, like a shadow wearing skin. It reached toward Ethan with a clawed hand that seemed to stretch farther than it should. There was no speech, no threat, just a pull, a sick, magnetic hunger. Ethan froze. The hand didn't touch him, but it didn't have to. Its presence alone filled him with a dread so complete, it shattered something deep inside. Then, just as the fear reached its peak, the light returned. It came like a wave, soft and steady but unstoppable. It poured into the darkness and pushed it back. The shadows recoiled. The screams grew faint. The hand withdrew. And Ethan, still shaking, still breathless in this strange state, felt himself being lifted out of the void. The warmth wrapped around him like arms, like a shield, like a rescue. He wanted to cry, but had no tears. "I don't ever want to go back there," he whispered into the light. And the light responded, not with words, but with a peace that filled every broken place inside him. Now he understood. Hell wasn't just a punishment. It was a separation, a chosen distance, the natural result of a lifetime running from love. And he had almost joined them. All his mocking, pride, and careless indifference had brought him within inches of that fate. But grace had stepped in. He was being spared, not because he deserved it, but because someone still believed in him, still had a plan for him, still loved him enough to say, "Look, feel, understand, and now, go tell them." Ethan didn't know what was coming next, but after what he had just seen, he would never, ever be the same. The light didn't just return. It exploded into the darkness like the dawn chasing away 1,000 midnights. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but it was absolute. Every shadow fled before it. Every echo of the screams faded into nothing. The chill in the air lifted, replaced by a warmth so complete it seemed to soak through every layer of Ethan's soul. And then, he was there. At first, Ethan saw only a figure in the glow, moving toward him with steps that seemed to carry both strength and grace. But as the distance closed, recognition struck him like a bolt of lightning. He didn't need an introduction. He didn't need anyone to whisper the name. He had seen pictures in Sunday school when he was a boy, paintings, sculptures, storybook illustrations. But those were faded shadows compared to the reality before him. It was Jesus. The thought didn't just come from his mind. It resonated from the deepest part of who he was. His presence was overwhelming, not because it was terrifying, but because it was pure. It was as if love itself had taken form and walked toward him. Every part of Ethan, every guarded corner, every hidden scar was suddenly laid bare, not to be shamed, but to be seen. Jesus' eyes met his. They weren't just looking at him. They were looking through him, into every memory, every motive, every moment that had shaped him. Ethan expected judgment, maybe even anger for the way he had lived. Instead, he saw something far more unsettling. Mercy. Mercy so deep it almost hurt to look at. And yet, there was also sadness in those eyes. Not disappointment, but grief. The kind of grief you feel for someone you love who has been wandering lost for too long. Ethan wanted to kneel, but he wasn't sure if he even had knees in this form. It wasn't about obligation. It was about impossibility. Standing upright in that presence felt like trying to stand against the wind of an entire universe. Jesus stepped closer, and as he did, something incredible happened. It wasn't a screen or a hologram or even a dream, but Ethan's life began to unfold before him as if time itself had bent open. He saw himself as a small boy, comforting his little sister when she woke from a nightmare. He saw afternoons filled with laughter, moments of kindness, the times he had chosen to help instead of turn away. These flashes made his heart swell for a moment, until the scenes shifted. He saw the other moments, the ones he had tried to bury, the lies, the harsh words, the times he had walked past someone who needed him, the bitterness he had nursed like a secret weapon, the mocking laughter he had aimed at people of faith. Each memory hit like a wave, not because Jesus forced him to relive them, but because the light made it impossible to hide from them. Ethan braced himself for rejection, for a voice telling him that he'd failed too badly to be given another chance. Instead, Jesus reached out his hand, or perhaps it was a light that felt like a hand, and touched him. Instantly, a rush of warmth poured into him, not a physical heat, but something richer, something alive. It was forgiveness, not as a concept, but as a force, a power that washed over every regret, every wrong, until the weight of them broke apart and dissolved. "You are forgiven," Jesus said. The words didn't just pass through the air. They sank into Ethan like seeds planted in the deepest soil. Forgiven. The word echoed in places inside him he didn't even know existed. Forgiven for the pride. Forgiven for the anger. Forgiven for the empty years of ignoring the one who stood before him now. But before he could breathe in the relief fully, Jesus' expression shifted, not in harshness, but in urgency. But forgiveness is not enough if you do not use the time you have. Ethan's heart, or whatever part of him still functioned in this state, thudded at those words. He knew what they meant, though Jesus hadn't yet told him directly. This wasn't just about wiping away the past. This was about a future, a mission, a calling that would demand something from him. Jesus didn't speak in riddles. His tone was like a father speaking to his son before sending him into a battle. Firm, loving, unshakably clear. Ethan wanted to say something, to promise he'd do better, to ask what exactly was being asked of him, but no words came. His thoughts felt too small, too fragile to offer to the one who already knew them all. And still, Jesus waited. Not impatiently, but with a kind of patient urgency, as though he knew Ethan needed to feel the weight of the moment before stepping into it. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was alive. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than noise. Ethan could feel that something was coming next, something bigger than anything he'd seen so far. This wasn't the end of the vision. It was a doorway. In that holy stillness, Ethan understood one thing with absolute clarity. His life was no longer his own. Whatever time he had left in the body he'd just seen pinned under that rock, it was going to be spent differently. Jesus' gaze never wavered. It wasn't a look of command. It was an invitation Ethan would never forget. The light around Ethan pulsed like a living heartbeat, and in an instant, the landscape shifted. No longer was he standing in the boundless glow before Jesus. Now he was suspended high above the earth, as if the whole continent lay stretched out beneath his feet. From this impossible height, every mountain range was a wrinkle in the skin of the earth, every river a silver thread winding through valleys. The Rockies towered to the west. The plains stretched endlessly to the east. But one place caught his eye immediately, burning in his vision with a deep, pulsing red. Yellowstone. It was his home turf. He knew those forests, those winding trails, the steamy geysers that sprayed into the crisp air. But what he saw now went beyond any map or memory. Beneath the surface, something massive and ancient stirred, like a beast sleeping under a thin sheet of earth. Ethan could feel it breathing, the pressure building with every heartbeat. Jesus stood beside him. His presence didn't need to be announced. It carried its own gravity. Ethan didn't have to ask what this meant. He felt it in his bones. "Ethan," Jesus said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of eternity. "You have been given this vision because time is shorter than people think. Many live as though tomorrow is guaranteed. But you have seen how quickly the earth can shake, how suddenly everything can change." Before Ethan could respond, the scene shifted again. He was no longer high above the world. Now he was standing in Yellowstone itself. It was summer, warm and golden. Tourists milled about, snapping pictures. Families laughed near Old Faithful. Bison grazed lazily in the distance. The air smelled of pine and earth, familiar and almost comforting. Almost. Because under that serene beauty, Ethan sensed something wrong, an invisible tension humming through the ground, like a guitar string pulled too tight. Jesus raised his hand, and the vision fractured. The first tremor hit. At first, people only looked around in confusion. A few chuckled nervously, assuming it was nothing. But then came a low, rumbling growl from deep within the earth, like the planet itself was groaning. Birds burst into the air in frantic flocks. Bison thundered away from the fields, their massive bodies shaking the ground. The second tremor was harder, sharper. The laughter was gone now, replaced by shouting. Rangers waved their arms, calling people to move back, to leave the area. And then it happened. The ground split open with a deafening crack. From the heart of Yellowstone, a pillar of fire, molten rock, and ash exploded skyward, taller than the clouds. It was not a gentle eruption. It was violent, primal, the very earth vomiting its fury into the sky. The blast was so powerful it seemed to tear the world in half. The roar drowned out all other sound. The sky darkened instantly as ash blotted out the sun. Day became night in seconds. Ethan's spirit trembled, not just from the force of what he saw, but from the horror of what it meant. This wasn't some localized disaster. This was something that would ripple far beyond the park's borders. Jesus' voice came to him, not angry, but saturated with sorrow. "Millions will not have time to escape," he said. "They are unprepared, not only for this moment, but for the moment when life itself ends. They do not know me. They have filled their lives with the noise of the world and turned their hearts away from truth. And when the earth groans like this, there will be no warning." Ethan watched as pyroclastic flows, rivers of molten rock and burning gas, poured from the ruptured ground, swallowing forests, roads, and entire campgrounds in moments. Cars sat abandoned, their metal frames warping in the heat. People ran, but there was nowhere to go. The vision pulled Ethan higher, showing him the disaster's reach. Salt Lake City, Denver, even parts of the Midwest fell under a snow of ash, falling thick and black like the sky itself was dying. Crops withered in minutes. Rivers turned into sludge. The wind carried the devastation across states like a silent plague. It wasn't just the land that was dying, it was hope. Ethan dropped to his knees in the vision, overwhelmed by the enormity of it. "Why are you showing me this?" he cried. "What could I possibly do to stop it?" Jesus knelt beside him, his eyes locking with Ethan's. They burned with compassion so fierce it almost hurt to meet them. "You cannot stop what is coming," he said gently. "But you can speak. You can tell them of me. You can tell them that this life is not the end, that even in disaster, I am the way to life eternal. You can tell them that my arms are open to all who will turn to me." As Jesus spoke, the fear in Ethan's spirit began to lift, not because the vision became less terrifying, but because he sensed the unshakable truth in his words. Even in the face of destruction, there was a refuge that fire and ash could never touch. The eruption still raged around them. Ash fell like black snow. The air shimmered with heat. Yet standing beside Jesus, Ethan felt shielded, as if an invisible wall stood between him and the chaos. Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not be afraid of what you have seen," he said. "It is better to fear nothing in this world than to live without me." The scene shifted one final time. Ethan was back above Yellowstone, looking down at the park as if the eruption had never happened. The geysers steamed quietly. The forests stood tall and green. The rivers ran clear. But the stillness was heavy, like the pause before a storm. Jesus' eyes held both urgency and mercy. "This time is not yet over," he said, "but it will not last forever. When it comes, it will come suddenly, and not everyone will be ready. That is why you will return. You have seen the fire. You have felt the weight of eternity. Now speak, Ethan. Speak while there is still time." And as Ethan looked again at the quiet park below, he understood. This was not just a warning about Yellowstone. It was a warning about the soul. Because just as the supervolcano waited in silence beneath the earth, judgment waited for every person who thought tomorrow was guaranteed. And tomorrow was never guaranteed. The vision did not stop with Yellowstone's eruption. Ethan was still standing high above the earth, the edges of the world blurred in shimmering light. But now the scene pulled back, stretching wider and wider until the entire United States lay before him. Its mountains, rivers, and cities still vivid, but already changing under the spreading shadow of ash. What began as a column of fire in Yellowstone had now become a monstrous cloud, black, churning, and alive, spilling across the sky. It rolled outward like an invading army, blotting out the sun as it moved. From his vantage point, Ethan could see entire states swallowed in darkness within hours. The first cities to vanish beneath the ash were the closest: Bozeman, Cody, Jackson. But the cloud didn't stop there. It moved on, devouring Salt Lake City, Denver, Cheyenne, until their skylines became ghostly silhouettes in the gloom. Streetlights flickered and died. The hum of civilization dimmed into silence. From above, the highways looked like veins clogged with desperation. Cars packed bumper to bumper, people abandoning them to run on foot, clutching children or dragging suitcases. But no matter how fast they ran, the ash was faster. It fell in thick, suffocating waves, coating everything in a lifeless gray. Ethan could feel their panic, like 1,000 pulses hammering against his spirit. He heard the coughs. The ragged breaths of people choking on air turned toxic. The cries of mothers calling out for children lost in the chaos. The shouts of fathers trying to break through crowds to reach their families. Jesus was beside him still, his eyes locked on the unfolding devastation. "They are unprepared," he said, voice steady yet heavy with grief. "Not just for this moment, but for the moment when life ends. They have not prepared their hearts. They have not turned to me." Ethan wanted to look away, but the vision pulled him closer, showing him what life was like on the ground. A small grocery store somewhere in the Midwest, its shelves bare, the floor littered with broken glass and abandoned carts. People fought over cans of food, their faces streaked with ash and sweat. Outside, the parking lot was filled with shouting, desperate hands pulling at anything that could be taken. In a suburban neighborhood, neighbors who once shared barbecues now argued at the edge of their driveways, accusing each other of hoarding supplies. The ash fell steadily, blanketing the streets like a burial shroud. Hospitals were overflowing. Hallways lined with people lying on blankets, gasping for air through improvised masks, scarves, shirts, torn bedsheets. Nurses and doctors moved frantically, their own faces gray with exhaustion and fear. Ethan saw military trucks in city centers, their loudspeakers echoing instructions. "Stay indoors, conserve water, do not attempt to travel." But outside, chaos reigned. In some places, the ash was so thick it turned daylight into a strange, suffocating night. And then, beyond the noise, came the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, but dread. Power grids failed. Streets went dark. Phones went dead. The hum of the modern world faded until only the sound of coughing, crying, and the crunch of footsteps in ash remained. From above, Ethan could see America's heartbeat slowing. Fields of corn and wheat, once oceans of green, were now gray deserts. Rivers ran dark and sluggish, poisoned by the fallout. Wildlife lay still along the banks. It wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was the unraveling of a nation. Jesus spoke again, his words steady but cutting through the heavy air like a bell in the fog. When people trust only in themselves, they build their houses on sand. And when the storm comes, when the ground shakes, they find they have nothing to stand on. Ethan's heart ached as the vision carried him farther still. The ash cloud moved eastward, reaching cities that had once seemed untouchable. Chicago, St. Louis, even New York felt its breath. Flights grounded, ports closed, trade halted. The country was no longer a patchwork of bustling communities. It was a scattering of islands, isolated, suffocating, cut off from one another. The vision zoomed in again. He saw a father kneeling in a darkened living room, holding his young daughter close as she wheezed in his arms. There was no medicine left, no clean air. He whispered something over and over, maybe her name, maybe a prayer. In another home, a woman sat alone at her kitchen table, hands clasped tightly together. She stared into the darkness, lips moving silently as tears rolled down her ash-covered face. Her Bible lay open before her, its pages rippling from the draft of a broken window. Even here, in the ruin, Jesus' presence reached out like a flicker of light in a cave. "Some will call my name in this darkness," he said, "and I will hear them. I will not abandon those who seek me." For a brief moment, Ethan saw those lights, small, fragile, but real, scattered across the ash-covered land. Families praying together, neighbors sharing what little they had, children clutching worn Bibles. The contrast was stark. The chaos raged, but faith still burned in pockets across the nation. Ethan realized then what this vision truly was. Not just a glimpse of disaster, but a spiritual map. The eruption was physical, but the collapse of America was deeper. It was the collapse of a people who had built their security on comfort, on wealth, on the illusion of control, without preparing their souls for eternity. Jesus turned to him once more. "Tell them, Ethan. Tell them to prepare. Not with fear, but with faith. For what is built on me will stand, even when the world falls." The words settled into Ethan's spirit like fire in his bones. He knew that when this vision ended, he would carry these images for the rest of his life. And though part of him wanted to wake up from it, another part knew this was not a nightmare. This was a warning. A warning for a nation on the edge. A warning for a nation on the edge. The ash did not stop. Day after day in the vision, Ethan watched it fall, slow and steady at first, then in great choking waves. It was like the sky had turned against the earth, covering every living thing in a shroud of death-gray snow. The once green fields of the Midwest were now lifeless plains. Corn stalks withered before harvest. Wheat fields lay crushed under the weight of the fallout, their golden heads bending toward the ground like mourners at a funeral. Farmers stood in silence, their weathered hands trembling as they stared at acres of ruined crops. Water sources turned foul. Rivers, once clear and teeming with life, were now dark, sluggish streams carrying ash and decay. Lakes reflected no sunlight, only the dull, suffocating gray above. Fish floated lifeless near the surface, their gills clogged, their bodies drifting toward the shore. And then the hunger began. At first, people rationed. They shared among neighbors, confident the crisis would pass quickly. But as the days bled into weeks, shelves emptied, gas stations closed, supermarkets became hollow shells of metal racks and broken glass. Food trucks stopped arriving. Even the black markets that rose from desperation could no longer supply what didn't exist. Ethan saw the change in people's faces. The first days had been filled with panic and fear, but now came the hollow-eyed stare of starvation. Children clung to their mothers with no strength to cry. Men searched dumpsters behind abandoned stores, fighting over scraps that wouldn't have fed a dog. The scenes blurred in front of him, showing pockets of violence erupting across the country. Cities once known for bright skylines and nightlife became war zones over a single loaf of bread. Gunshots cracked in the night. Windows shattered. Trust between neighbors disintegrated into suspicion and betrayal. Jesus' voice cut through the noise, not loud, but sharp with sorrow. "This is not only a famine of the body," he said. "It is a famine of the soul. They have filled themselves with everything but truth, and now they are empty." The words hit Ethan harder than the images themselves. This wasn't just about food and water. This was about something deeper, something people had been starving for long before the eruption. They had been feeding on distractions, pleasures, and false securities, mistaking them for sustenance. Now, with everything stripped away, the emptiness could no longer be ignored. The vision pulled him closer into the lives of those suffering. In one home, a mother cradled her baby, both of them covered in a thin layer of ash. She whispered to the child, trying to soothe him, though her own lips were cracked and pale from thirst. In another, a group of strangers huddled around a single candle, sharing a half-empty bottle of water in silence, each sip taken like a sacred ritual. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, there were flickers of light. Ethan saw small groups gathering to pray, their hands clasped tightly, their eyes lifted to the unseen. Some prayed in whispers, others in sobs. They weren't asking for riches or comfort. They were begging for hope, for forgiveness, for strength to endure. In a church with broken windows and ash on its pews, a pastor read from a weathered Bible by lantern light. His voice was hoarse but steady. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. People listened, not out of habit, but because they knew those words were their lifeline. Jesus looked at Ethan, his face lit with both pain and compassion. "Do you see how fragile life is?" he asked. "Do you see how quickly everything they trust can fall apart? Tell them I am the bread of life. Tell them that those who come to me will never hunger, and those who believe in me will never thirst." The scenes shifted again, showing the passage of weeks as though time had been sped up. The ash continued to spread, carried by winds across oceans. Countries far from America's borders now faced their own crop failures, their own shortages. Markets collapsed. Ships sat idle in harbors. Hunger was no longer a regional crisis, it was global. Riots broke out in cities Ethan couldn't even name. Soldiers patrolled streets. Families packed what little they had and walked for miles in search of food, water, or safety, often finding none. And yet, even as the world trembled, Ethan could see the quiet resilience of those who had placed their hope not in governments, but in God. They were still hungry. They were still thirsty. But their spirits were anchored in something unshakable. He watched as one small community, their own supplies nearly gone, chose to share the last of their food with a group of strangers. He saw a child give half of her piece of bread to a boy she had never met. The kindness shone like a candle in a storm, and Ethan realized what Jesus had been showing him all along. In the world's darkest hours, true sustenance was not measured in calories, but in compassion. The vision began to dim, the ash and hunger fading into a soft, golden glow. Jesus' hand rested gently on Ethan's shoulder. "Ethan, you must tell them," he said. "They think they have time, but time is running short, not just for the world, but for every soul. Do not let them waste the days they have left chasing what will not last." Ethan felt those words sear into his being like fire into stone. The famine would end one day. The earth would heal. But the famine of the soul, that could last forever, unless hearts turned back to the one who could fill them. The moment the light returned, it was as if every trace of pain, fear, and suffocating despair was erased from Ethan's soul. It didn't creep in. It surged, like the tide rushing in to reclaim the shore after a long retreat. The gray ash, the sound of crying, the oppressive air of famine, they vanished in an instant. What replaced them was not just beauty, it was life itself. At first, Ethan thought he was standing in a dream, but no dream had ever been this vivid, this solid, this real. The air itself seemed alive. Every breath filled him with energy, with a joy so pure it made his spirit ache. He realized he wasn't just seeing colors, he was feeling them. Every hue sang its own note in a symphony that wrapped around him like an embrace. The sky above wasn't merely blue, it was a living ocean of light, stretching into eternity, deep and layered like it held every sunrise and sunset ever painted across creation. The ground under his feet was soft, but strong, like walking on woven light. Every step sent ripples of delight through his being. The horizon was endless, a canvas of rolling meadows shimmering in gold. Fields of grass swayed in a breeze that didn't just move air, it carried music, a harmony that blended the laughter of streams, the rustle of leaves, and voices that seemed to sing without words. Crystal rivers wound through the landscape, each drop of water glowing as though it had captured a fragment of the light. The flow made music of its own, perfectly in tune with the wind and the song of creation. Trees towered nearby, their leaves shining with colors Ethan had no name for. Each branch bore fruit that pulsed with an inner radiance. The fragrance drifting from them was so rich, so pure, that just breathing it in filled him with a deeper peace. Flowers carpeted the meadows, some small and delicate, others tall and bursting with light. They didn't just open and close, they moved like they were praising the one who made them. Then Ethan noticed something strange. There was no sun, no single source of light in the sky. Yet everything was lit perfectly. The light seemed to come from everywhere, flowing from the rivers, the trees, even from the air itself. But most of all, it poured from the presence walking beside him. Jesus. Here in this place, his presence was even more radiant than before. Not just love, but joy overflowing, joy that shook Ethan's core and made him feel more alive than he'd ever been. They walked together along a winding path, and then Ethan saw someone ahead. A man was running toward him, his face lit with joy. For a second, Ethan's spirit stuttered. Then recognition crashed over him. His grandfather, the man who had died when Ethan was just 6 years old. But here he was young again, his back straight, his steps strong, his eyes bright with a light that had nothing to do with age. Ethan didn't need words, they embraced, and the love flowing between them was like a river, deep, unbroken, eternal. Tears filled Ethan's eyes, but they weren't heavy tears. They were tears of homecoming, the kind that spring up when every part of you knows, I belong here. Jesus placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, speaking in a tone that blended celebration with mission. Every soul that chooses me is home here, he said. But remember, many are not ready. Many choose pride and refuse my love. You have seen where that path leads. The memory of hell's darkness flashed briefly in Ethan's mind, a cold shadow against the warmth of this place. The contrast was unbearable. This beauty, this peace, it was what every human heart was aching for, even if they didn't know it. And yet so many would turn away. Jesus led him deeper into the valley ahead. At its center rose a throne, not made of stone or wood, but of light so pure it was impossible to look at directly. The air trembled with its presence. From it rolled waves of love and power, so great they could have crushed him, yet instead they lifted him, filling every part of his being with strength. Ethan knew without being told, this was the presence of God the Father. No voice spoke from the throne, but Ethan felt it, felt the welcome, the belonging, the knowledge that he had been known fully from the very first moment of his existence. The weight of holiness here was unlike anything he'd ever felt. It demanded no bow, yet made him want to fall to his knees. It inspired no fear, yet stripped away every shred of ego, leaving only awe. Jesus looked at him, his eyes holding a depth that made Ethan feel like he was standing at the edge of eternity itself. You will return to your life, Ethan, he said, but I want you to remember what you have seen. Tell them that heaven is real. Tell them I am preparing a place for them. Many think this life is all there is, but they are wrong. There is more, so much more. if they will turn to me." Ethan wanted to promise he would. He wanted to tell Jesus he'd never stop speaking of this place. But the words felt too small, too thin for the enormity of what filled his soul. All he could do was nod, overwhelmed. "Come," Jesus said gently. "There is more I must show you before you return." The valley shimmered as though it were made of living glass. Ethan felt the pull again, a soft but unstoppable current, urging him forward. His heart clenched at the thought of leaving. He had never known such peace, such belonging, such absolute love. But he realized something in that moment. This wasn't goodbye. This was a promise, a place prepared. And he knew, when his time on earth ended, he would run back here without hesitation. The golden light of heaven faded, not like a candle being blown out, but like the slow retreat of dawn, giving way to something heavier. Ethan felt the warmth slip from his skin, replaced by a chill that sank into his bones. The air thickened. The music of rivers and wind was gone. When his vision cleared, he was no longer standing in the valley of light. He was back on earth, or rather suspended above it, looking down on a world that seemed almost unrecognizable after the glory he had just seen. It was nighttime, but not the peaceful kind. The sky glowed with a sickly orange haze from city lights and pollution, a man-made twilight that drowned out the stars. Streets were jammed with cars, horns blaring, their drivers staring blankly ahead. Massive billboards flickered with ads, shoes, phones, celebrity gossip, each one screaming for attention. Ethan could feel the hum of distraction, like static in the air. He was drawn closer, zooming down into neighborhoods and city blocks. In restaurants, people scrolled through glowing screens instead of talking to the person across from them. In living rooms, families sat in silence, each member locked into their own digital world. Even in quiet moments, the world seemed addicted to noise. Music blasting from earbuds, endless videos autoplaying, news feeds refreshing by the second. It wasn't that they were all doing evil. They were simply absent. Number. And then Jesus' voice came, low but cutting through the haze like a blade. "They are asleep, Ethan. Their eyes are open, but their souls are closed." Ethan's chest tightened. He could see it now, not just distraction, but blindness. People were filling every spare second with something, anything, to avoid stillness. Because in stillness, the truth speaks, and the truth makes demands. He was pulled further into the lives of individuals. A businessman sat in his sleek apartment, surrounded by expensive furniture, staring at a bank statement on his laptop with a hollow expression. A young woman posed for a photo in front of a mirror, her smile flawless but her eyes dull, her phone already buzzing with likes before she'd even lowered it. In another home, a father flipped through TV channels while his teenage son sat in the next room, alone, headphones on, drowning in a playlist that kept him from feeling the weight of his own loneliness. No one was looking up. No one was listening. The scene shifted to churches, some large, some small. Ethan expected to see light here, but what he saw made his spirit ache. In many places, people came and went as if checking a box. Sermons were shortened to fit schedules. Worship was treated like a concert, entertaining but shallow. The fire of faith had been replaced with routine, the urgency of eternity dulled by comfort. Jesus' voice grew heavier. "Even here, some have traded my presence for performance. They know my name, but they do not know me." Ethan's mind flashed back to the throne of light, to the overwhelming love of the Father. And now, this, a people chasing shadows, thinking they held substance. The vision pulled back again, showing him the world at large. Nations argued over borders, over politics, over money, while ignoring the rot eating away at their own hearts. Leaders made speeches about progress while their people starved, not just for food, but for truth. Entertainment drowned out warnings. Comfort lulled people into complacency. And underneath it all, Ethan could feel the clock ticking. Jesus stepped into his view, not as a distant figure now, but right before him. His eyes held the same fierce compassion Ethan had seen in heaven, but also a deep sadness. Ethan, they are living as though they will never stand before me. They chase what will vanish. They prepare for everything but the only moment that matters. The weight of his words pressed into Ethan's spirit. He understood now. The greatest danger wasn't always disaster or famine or even the eruption he had seen. It was the slow drift of a soul lulled into sleep, never realizing how close it was to eternity. The vision drew him closer into moments that revealed this truth. A man sat in his car, stuck in traffic, cursing under his breath, unaware that in just a few hours, a heart attack would claim his life. A young couple argued over vacation plans, not knowing that an accident next week would end one of their stories forever. Ethan felt an urgency rising in him, an almost unbearable need to shout, "Wake up! Look up! You don't have forever!" Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder, steady but strong. "You will tell them," he said. "Some will listen, many will not. But you must speak as though every word is their last chance, because for some, it will be." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to argue, to say the task was too heavy for him, too big for one voice. But the memory of heaven burned behind his eyes. The faces of the lost in hell's darkness haunted him. The image of a distracted, sleeping world gripped him like a vice. The vision began to fade again, but this time Ethan felt the weight of it follow him. The light of heaven had shown him what was waiting. The darkness of earth had shown him what was at stake. This wasn't just a message. It was a rescue mission. It was a rescue mission. The world spun beneath Ethan like a clock ticking down its final seconds. He could feel it. Time wasn't moving in days or years anymore, but in heartbeats. Every beat brought the world closer to something irreversible. He was suspended high above the earth again, but this time there was no haze of distraction, no warm light of heaven, only clarity. The view was sharp, almost painfully so. He could see continents, cities, mountains, and oceans, all bathed in the pale light of a setting sun. Shadows stretched long across the land, as if the day itself was running out. Jesus stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There was no fear in his eyes, but there was an intensity that made Ethan's own heart race. "The time is shorter than they think," Jesus said. "What is coming will shake every nation, but what will matter most is the condition of the heart when it comes." Suddenly, the vision shifted into motion. Ethan saw scenes unfolding in rapid succession, each one like the tick of a clock's second hand. He saw earthquakes ripping through cities, skyscrapers swaying before crumbling into clouds of dust. He saw waves, towering walls of water, crashing into coastlines, swallowing entire neighborhoods. He saw the skies turning red with storms so fierce they ripped trees from the ground and sent them spiraling like matchsticks. And yet, amid all this chaos, he saw something far more terrifying. People still ignoring the warning. Markets reopened, stadiums filled, news anchors smiled through polished headlines. Politicians gave speeches promising safety. It was as though humanity was determined to keep dancing while the ground shook beneath them. Ethan wanted to shout, but the vision wasn't done. He saw a massive clock tower, its hands spinning wildly, then slowing, then stopping at 1 minute to midnight. The air around it pulsed like a living thing, each pulse sending a shockwave across the earth. Jesus' voice came again, urgent now. When this moment comes, there will be no time to prepare. That is why I am speaking now. That is why I am sending you back. The scenes intensified. Ethan saw believers gathering in secret, praying in candlelit rooms while the world outside mocked their faith. He saw small acts of courage. A woman sharing her last loaf of bread with a stranger. A man risking his life to smuggle Bibles into a place where owning one meant prison. The contrast was stark. Some hearts were hardening, others were burning brighter. The pressure of the times was revealing what lay hidden in the soul. Then Ethan was pulled to a single image, a great fireball tearing through the darkness of space, glowing brighter and larger as it approached the earth. It wasn't random, it was aimed. The sight froze his blood. This, Jesus said, is not meant to terrify you, but to awaken you. My people must be ready, not just for this, but for the moment they will stand before me. That moment will come for each soul, whether the world ends in fire or in silence. The fireball filled his vision until nothing else remained. And then, silence. When the image cleared, Ethan stood once more on the edge of heaven's light and earth's darkness. He felt the weight of the message pressing into him like a seal on his soul. This wasn't just about Yellowstone. It wasn't just about natural disasters. It was about eternity. Jesus stepped closer, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. Ethan, I'm sending you back. You will tell them what you have seen. You will warn them. But more than that, you will tell them that my arms are still open. Until the final breath, until the last heartbeat, anyone who calls on my name will be saved. The urgency in his tone wasn't anger. It was love on fire. The kind of love that refuses to stay silent when danger is near. The vision began to dissolve, the edges of light and shadow blurring together. Ethan felt himself being pulled away, the sounds of heaven fading, the hum of the earth growing louder. His last sight before the vision ended was Jesus' face, steadfast, compassionate, unshakable. Go, Ethan. Time is short. And then, everything went black. The darkness didn't last. Ethan's eyes flew open, and with a gasp, the weight of reality came crashing in, air flooding his lungs, the sharp scent of pine and dust filling his nostrils, the crushing pain in his leg returning like a lightning strike. He was lying on the rocky slope near Yellowstone, pinned under the boulder that had nearly killed him. The sky above was the same blue he'd known his whole life, but after what he had just seen, it looked different. He could hear voices, Ryan shouting his name, Caleb scrambling down toward him, the clatter of loose stones. The sound was urgent, desperate. "Hold on, Ethan! We've got you!" He wanted to answer, but the words caught in his throat. His heart was still pounding from the vision, his mind torn between two worlds, the eternal one he had just left and the fragile one he'd returned to. When Ryan and Caleb finally freed his leg and dragged him to safety, Ethan barely noticed the pain. His body was here, but his spirit still felt the echo of heaven's light and the weight of Jesus' warning. The paramedics arrived, voices clipped and efficient, strapping him to a stretcher, checking his vitals. One of them muttered, "You're lucky to be alive, kid." Ethan wanted to tell him, "No, I'm not lucky. I was sent back." The ride to the hospital was a blur. Sirens wailed, tires hummed against the asphalt, and the mountains passed in streaks outside the window. But inside Ethan's mind, the images were crystal clear. The fields of heaven swaying in golden light, the darkness of hell swallowing lost souls, the ash-choked famine, the fireball tearing through space, and above all, the voice of Jesus. "Go, Ethan. Time is short." By the time they wheeled him into the ER, Ethan knew he could never return to who he was before the fall. The old Ethan, the one who dismissed faith as superstition, who lived for comfort and entertainment, was gone. In his place stood someone who had seen the other side, someone who carried a message that burned in his bones. Days later, when the swelling in his leg went down and the doctors said he'd make a full recovery, Ethan didn't waste time. Still weak, still limping, he started telling his story. To his parents first, then to his friends, then to anyone who would listen. Some laughed, some listened politely and changed the subject, but others leaned in, eyes wide, as if they could almost see what he had seen. He told them about the beauty of heaven, not as a vague hope, but as a real, tangible place, alive with joy and light. He told them about the darkness of hell and the sorrow of Jesus' voice when he showed Ethan what separation from him truly meant. He told them about Yellowstone's ticking time bomb, the famine, the collapse, and the great distraction keeping the world spiritually asleep. He told them about the final warning. But he didn't stop there. Every time he spoke, he ended with the same truth Jesus had pressed into his soul. His arms are still open. Until your last breath, until your last heartbeat, you can turn to him and be saved. Months passed, and the urgency never faded. In fact, it grew. Ethan began sharing his testimony at youth groups, in small churches, even at open-air gatherings in parks. He didn't care if people called him crazy. He'd seen too much to stay silent. Late one night, as he stood alone under Montana's wide sky, the Milky Way stretched above him like a river of light. Ethan whispered a prayer, not the kind he used to mutter out of habit, but one born from the very core of his being. "Jesus, I'll keep telling them. As long as I have breath, I'll keep telling them." And he knew the mission wasn't just his. It was for anyone who had ears to hear. Anyone who understood that life is a vapor, that eternity is one heartbeat away, and that there's a place prepared for those who choose him. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the warmth of heaven's light again. Not because he was back there, but because he was carrying a piece of it with him now, into a world that desperately needed to wake up. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of his rescue mission. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of his rescue mission. And maybe it could be the beginning of yours. If what you've heard has stirred something deep in you, don't let it fade. Share your thoughts below